Thank you. My name is Jennifer Wang. I am the executive director of the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health. I have a background in sustainability, public health, and its intersection as one of these multi-dimensional topics that climate change is. I feel like I've always thought of it as something that affects all of us. And so my background in sustainability kind of led me into looking more into the public health impacts of climate change and various environmental issues. So I am really glad to be in the role that I'm in, I think professionally, but I think also, it's something that has resonated with me throughout my life. In my kind of informal, volunteer gig, I'm also an elected official in Glastonbury. I'm on the town council. So I sort of have some experience in terms of how things look from a municipal side, and just thinking about how our little state has all these different corners and little towns. So I bring some of that kind of municipal experience as well. I don't know what else you would like for background.
That is fantastic background. I'm glad that the role that you have professionally exists.
I am too.
And that you are doing it. And I look forward to touching on a number of those different aspects that you've mentioned as we talk.
Great. Yeah.
Is there, I already have questions that I could start off with. Is there anything that comes to your mind or has already come to your mind since we spoke last week that you might want to start off our conversation with? Or
sure.
Yeah, I would love to.
I know. It's hard to just limit it to one thing, but I think maybe the key frame that I've been thinking about is, we're talking about how climate change affects us, me personally, but our communities, our state, our world. And if you ask an average person in Connecticut, what their top concerns are with the world, I don't know that many people would necessarily say climate change. I think certain segments of the population would say that, and that's reflected in public opinion polling as well. So it's not necessarily top of mind for an average person on an average day. However, after an extreme event or in the middle of a wildfire smoke episode, it might rise a little bit more to the top, but it still might not. And then that incidence passes, and then it again kind of falls into a background concern, if it's a concern at all. That said, I think some of the opinion polling coming out of Yale Program on Climate Change Communications, which is a different entity at Yale than the My Center, although we both have 3 Cs, their polling has shown that the amount of Americans who are concerned with climate change is growing, and the amount of Americans who are kind of deniers is shrinking. So I think there is more awareness, there is more concern, but it's still not kind of like a core kitchen table economic issue. And where I come from is looking at climate change's health impacts. And I think health is one of the more interesting topics that is more kitchen table. Again, maybe not everybody thinks or talks about it all the time. We're just all living our lives and trying to be as healthy as we can be. But that connection kind of makes it more human. Which is why I was fascinated by it, and why we have this field of climate change and health that I think people are really drawn to, is making that human connection. And that human connection, it might not be very immediate, or it's immediate and then it fades, but it's kind of something that exacerbates existing threats to human health and well-being. And so because of that kind of underlying, this underlying risk factor in a number of ways, which I could get into later, that's kind of where the opportunity is in terms of improving people's health, in terms of preventing premature death, and preventing really the strains on health systems, and preventing strains on just, families and communities, and the public response that's required for climate impacts. If you think of an extreme storm and the impacts that has on, public safety, on emergency management, on our infrastructure, those come with some pretty high costs in some cases. And that adds up over time. So it's thinking about it as just this risk multiplier or exacerbator. That's kind of where we think over time there's going to be a lot of impact, both on people's health and I think on our economy and our overall sort of social well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, as you mentioned, the degree to which people recognize, the number of people who recognize that climate change is, or have it on the constant awareness list versus I think of it when there is an extreme weather event. Like as you have just been describing, and what little like my awareness of it was before is looking at the intersection between climate change and health. Is that something that actually provides a framework for recognizing and seeing the through line in climate change in a way? It's like it's present, like there is an element of a reality that we are, and does that kind of allow it to be seen in your mind on a more regular basis rather than only recognizing the peaks and challenges?
Yeah, I think so personally. And I think, growing awareness in different fields. So we work, at the Yale School of Public Health, we work with public health professionals, researchers, but also doctors and kind of clinical health professionals, looking at it both from a sort of treating the sick individual as well as preventing future sickness in an individual's perspective. I do think that highlighting all the different ways that climate change impacts health does make a lot of sense in bringing clarity to the average person's mind around climate change, but also from that sort of public health practitioner's perspective, it's also like what is actually actionable, right. Both on the prevention side and on the treatment side, and then. I'm kind of jumping a bit between sort of the health professionals and the everybody else.
That's okay.
In terms of everybody else, we think of when we think of prevention or treatment, it's like what is modifiable in somebody's behavior, in their environment, like when you're having when you have like a chronic condition like high blood pressure, you're going to have to ideally change your diet. Ideally, you have to stop smoking and stop drinking. And there's a few things, or have a less stressful lifestyle, which arguably may not be modifiable. And so it's all about like what can we actually change. And so when we think of climate change's impacts on health, even without the looking at like the individual's like actions, when we look at it in terms of like government's actions or industry's actions, that's actually something that because it's actually harming people, then it should be modified. And can it be modified? And we think that it certainly can be. There needs to be more political will to move faster and bolder. And that health argument, we hope, and in some cases has, sort of driven that action and sort of raised that level of political will or convinced a decision maker to take a different action for the sake of protecting people, rather than thinking about, the lost economic costs from not having this, fossil fuel development.
Yeah.
So those are just kind of like that humanizing of it brings it home for people, both kind of an individual as well as a broader scale.
Which is kind of a fascinating shift. So just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, we recognize at this point some industrial, governmental, systemic practices and choices that have been made, that making changes there, is what will be required to potentially change our climate future. But those actions feel remote, seem remote. It's hard to get the political will and the financial commitment to make that happen. Whereas making those same changes make actionable positive effects in the lives of humans who are alive now. and that is something that possibly does, it's easier for people to sign on to them for those reasons.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice. That's really interesting. And as you mentioned before, like it is surprising to me, just based on things that were known about the environment when I was a child already, where it's like, this connection is here. If we don't change this, this is going to happen into our environment, like within X number of years. That was 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago. And one would think that it would have sunk in more over time, or the reality of that and the need for making changes. But since it somehow hasn't, thank goodness that, there's a greater understanding of connection between those same things and people's health, and that is maybe another way to go about making changes happen. At what point in time in your career did you shift from your beginnings in the sustainability side of things into the climate change public health role that you're currently working in, and what perspectives have shifted for you since you have kind of made that step into a related but different part of your work?
Yeah. Okay. I don't know how much of this is relevant, but for me, this is the story in my mind of how I came to this place and time.
That's relevant
in the world. So I was a chemistry major in college, and I was always interested in environmental stuff, and I did like all the environmental clubs. There were just so many of them, and I was volunteering for everything. And I majored in chemistry because it's like, it's a hard science, and it's like you can go into grad school, or you can go into industry, and like you can switch to social sciences later. It's good background. And I was like, okay, I can do it. I actually kind of like it. So I was like doing it's actually some research around like developing materials that can have environmental health impacts. So like new novel nanomaterials that can be used to develop kind of cheaper solar energy productions, like solar photovoltaics, using like kitchen materials like olive oil and, like rust. And you can come up with these materials that can convert sunlight into energy. Very, very low efficiency, but could be a really interesting product in the future, right? Or like looking at removing arsenic from drinking water using, materials like material science stuff. And like working in these chemistry labs and just feeling like, I think I'm more of a people person. Like I kind of like my mixing stuff in my beakers. And I mean, some of these applications for these materials are also quite far down the line. And that sort of led me into thinking, what is potentially more human oriented. So I kind of shifted a little bit and went into sustainability consulting. And I was working in Chicago with a nonprofit called the Delta Institute. They're still around. They work within around the Great Lakes region on sustainable economic development. So, and my particular emphasis was on green buildings, specifically existing buildings. And I worked on this big project called the Merchandise Mart, which if you've ever been to Chicago, it's a huge like expo center, and it takes up like 2 city blocks and has its own zip code.
Oh, wow.
So we did LEED certification, like green building certification on the Merchandise Mart. And it was just a really great challenge. I worked with some really ambitious people and just a great team at the Mart. And went through that and various other LEED certification processes. I realized like a lot of the sort of like things in the checklist that you have to check off and get points for are environmental initiatives, but they are actually really tied to human health. So using like low volatile organic chemicals, like products that have low VOC emissions in cleaning or in flooring or in decorating. All of those have human health impacts, and you score better if you minimize those. Reducing your electricity use and recycling, and like encouraging your employees to take public transportation. Those all have public benefits, both directly in terms of increasing, walking and biking, this kind of like active transportation, And it will, prevent pollution in terms of the demand on, single occupancy vehicle cars. And it will have a climate benefit by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it kind of has like these three layers of benefits to the individual, to your local community, as well as to the global climate. So I just thought it was really interesting. And I was looking for a change, wanted to go to grad school, and just looked at programs that sort of combined climate change and health, which is, there isn't really, there at the time, there weren't really any. My center now has an MPH concentration, like Masters of Public Health concentration in climate change and health, but that wasn't around when I was looking. So yeah, that's kind of how I went into this, just seeing that sort of inherent human connection to sustainability initiatives.
Yeah, very cool. And how, it sounds like how cool to have been working on such a large scale project, so to speak. Like, I'm familiar with like LEED certifications in relation to individual homes and individual office buildings and things like that.
Yeah.
But working on such a large project and kind of having like a very, very clear example of how like those small things, at scale make a really big difference.
Yeah. And it was also kind of a demonstration. It was kind of like, if the merchandise mart can do it, and they just have like, just like tons of visitors every year, just a lot of different types of uses. If they can do it, then nobody else really has an excuse not to. Obviously, they have economies of scale, but it was very much like a demonstration and sort of leveraging also their purchasing power. And yeah, it was a good experience.
That's really cool. I imagine we're going to bounce back and forth between a number of these topics over the course of our conversation, but like kind of, thinking about that makes me curious now with, that experience in your background, working at the Yale Center for Climate Change and Health, or, running the Yale Center of Climate Change and Health, and then also, having those in your background, but kind of looking at your work on the town council in Glastonbury. What is it? How is that? What is that? I don't know. How long have you been on the council, and what is it like looking at? Is it silly to kind of like look at the work of you and your fellow council members in Glastonbury and viewing the tasks that are under your responsibility through a related lens, if that makes sense? How does that?
What's that experience like? I've been on the council for about 4 years, so I'm in my second term. And I kind of ran on a platform of climate and health, as funny as that sounds.
No, it doesn't.
Because when I first ran, it was 2021. So we were coming out of a sort of a COVID psyche. And public health was really top of mind, and that kind of prevention and sort of community prevention and community protection was on people's minds. And we were also, I think just every year there's climate crises, not necessarily in Glastonbury at the time, but I think it was on people's minds, maybe even a little more so than now. I don't know, just because there's other worries on people's minds now. And I think the idea of a healthy, safe climate, a healthy environment, and a safe climate is something that resonates with voters. Again, not maybe their top thing, but in Glastonbury, I think a lot of people live there because of the schools and the quality of life. And we're on the river, but we have these nice parks. So I think there's kind of an understanding and an appreciation for sustainability. Glastonbury also, as a town, has done a lot around sustainability and energy efficiency and solar on buildings, and recognized by Sustainable CT as a climate leader. So there's a number of things that were going for the town, and I didn't see it as like a controversial issue, even if it wasn't like top of mind. And then in terms of serving on the council, it's not like we're necessarily like we're not setting targets for like greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Personally, I think we're already at a pretty good baseline, but we're not going to, like, as a municipality, there's so much we can do, switching our lawnmowers to electric, like things like that. So there's a number of things the municipality could do, but it's not like something that I'm working on a regular basis that the town isn't already doing. But there's a lot of related things that the town council is pretty actively working on or actively considers. And it's a budget question. And so when we were always like trying to apply for grants through the state or the federal government around like building sidewalks and increasing community connectivity, providing people with ways to get around that don't involve cars, improving pedestrian safety, like all of those, again, get into those kind of personal, community, and climate co-benefits. There's also a big issue in the state, as we know, is housing, especially affordable housing, and I think it's a really big topic in Glastonbury. There's a lot of just like people and community leaders who are interested in increasing the sort of housing diversity. We have a lot of single-family homes. Some really large homes. We have some apartments, but there's a sense of our population is aging. Our elders are they don't need to live in 4-bedroom homes on 2 acres, and it's hard for them to maintain that, especially if they're on a fixed income. But they want to stay in the community, but they don't have a place to go to. Some of them are living in older homes that don't have air conditioning, and they're in a remote forested lot or something. And we are, our summers are getting warmer. There are sort of more frequent and or intense and or prolonged heat waves, and that sort of housing question gets at various populations. So our senior population, also young families who have kids with asthma. Families who just like anybody who has like a pre-existing condition who may live in housing that is, like if it's too large for them, then it's like they can't afford to air condition the whole thing, or they don't have air conditioning, or it's something where they live in maybe, not like I don't think we have a lot of substandard housing, but I think it is an issue in municipalities where if you have substandard housing, people that are like, not well ventilated. And so you're cooking in kitchens that are using gas stoves, and it's creating a lot of, if you're doing a lot of frying, it's creating particulate matter, and that can exacerbate respiratory conditions, especially, childhood asthma. So a lot of these, like when we look at like increasing sidewalks and like pedestrian safety and like having better quality housing that is, properly has proper HVAC and is maybe like located on a bus line or located near a walking trail and has enough trees, in a kind of a more wooded neighborhood or something. Those all affect health and climate. And so, I think those interconnections are just kind of like automatic in my mind, but I think I think that it basically like you don't have to look at it from a climate lens, but improving housing and walkability is something that resonates with people. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
As I know you acknowledged early on in our conversation, like at this point in time, it seems like the trends are that more people are accepting of and recognizing climate change as a reality, and the number of folks who are, on the other side of the spectrum and denying, climate denial, do you encounter folks from that side of the climate change spectrum through either your work at Yale or through your work on the council in Glastonbury? And if so, how do you find common ground with folks or find a way to work together on things that need to get done?
I think thankfully I don't encounter that a lot, and that's not to say that it might just be the people that I interact with, but I do occasionally come across just like questioning of to what extent are these natural cycles in, atmospheric conditions, and what about just kind of like some whataboutism, like, well, like it might be getting hotter, but also we know that extreme cold does have health impacts. And so if winters and springs are getting warmer, isn't that good for health? And I very rarely encounter sort of like straight up denial that, that climate change is happening at all. I also very rarely encounter sort of the denial that humans cause climate change. I think there's some sort of that acknowledgement, but then it becomes the what if, or the whataboutism. If we want to switch to electric vehicles, what about the human impact of the mining for the lithium that needs to be used for batteries? And then where do batteries go? How are they being recycled? Are they being transported to developing countries that don't have as strong safety laws as we do? And isn't that harmful? And so yeah, I do sometimes encounter that, and the way that we look at it, and I personally look at it, is like there might be a few, but there's usually no technology or energy system that completely doesn't have impacts, and so then it's a matter of like what degree and where and how it has impacts, and that, so it's not to say it's invalid to be concerned about battery recycling or where the materials are coming from. But when you look at the relative impact of, let's just take vehicles like an electric vehicle versus a internal combustion engine vehicle, over the course of its sort of life cycle, this starts getting into wonky like life cycle assessment, but just looking at sort of the materials that are used and then the burning of the fossil fuels as it's being operated for, 100,000 miles, 200, 300, depending, what kind of car you have, then that is sort of the marker of the overall impact. And to try to reduce that wherever you can. And even with an internal combustion engine vehicle, you can look for a smaller vehicle. You can, look at those fuel efficiency standards. And it's a matter of degree. And when you really compare different forms of energy and modes of transportation, that there's just some really stark differences. So and the other way that I look at it is, if I'm talking to somebody who's just really questioning, why we need to drive smaller cars and, you can't take my truck away from me, is that, hey, it's innovation, right? So the global economy, and again, just go back to the car example, people want electric cars, and it's just an economic competition question. And so that's why you'll see, I think a few weeks ago, Ford, announced like an electric truck that's going to be sold for, don't quote me on this, I think it's like under $30,000. It's like $30,000 or something, maybe 40. And that's going to be their entry level like electric truck. And they're like, we're going to, that's something that they feel strongly is going to help them in terms of their global competitiveness. Whether or not American consumers pick up on that, we'll see. But I'm kind of like, I would like a pickup truck, and I would never buy something that's like a total gas guzzler. I'd probably go for something like 20 years old that just can use to haul stuff around. But, an affordable kind of entry level electric truck, maybe that is of interest. Yeah. So I think that sort of like keeping up with global competition is another way to look at it. The job creation around some new technologies is also interesting. So kind of taking it away from that, it can be unfortunately politically divisive to talk about climate change at all. I think there's an implication that you're going to have to change your lifestyle, and you're going to have to go vegan, and you're going to have to drive this tiny little, electric vehicle, and like you're going to be forced to take buses everywhere. I mean, it'd be great to try to do all of those things from an environmental perspective. But there's so many things we can do incrementally, and it will be better, even if you don't care about climate change at all. You're going to save money at the gas pump, or if you're going to adopt an induction stove or heat pumps or something, like you might find yourself saving on your electric bills. You might find that your air is cleaner at home and that your water boils faster. There's just some sort of like inherent benefits that you can't really argue against. Unless you just have a complete unwillingness to change, which also happens and is understandable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From the perspective that you have, from working with the Yale Center for Climate Change and Health, and what you've learned from your own studies and from your colleagues, and having the picture of coming climate change that you do to whatever degree we can foresee. What brings you hope at this moment in time as you look forward?
That's a great question. I sometimes not a lot, but there always has to be hope. I think one of the greatest hopeful things that I'm seeing, and this actually came out of the conference we organized yesterday. It was called the Connecticut Symposium on Climate Change and Health. And it was convened as an opportunity both to share what the latest climate projections are for for Connecticut in terms of heat and sea level rise, what that means in terms of health impacts, how is that going to affect different populations in different diseases, how is that going to harm like different bodily systems, and which kind of demographically who's going to be affected. How prepared are we, like in terms of emergency response, and what does that look like from an environmental justice perspective? Sort of who pays and who benefits from some of the things that are causing climate chaos. So that was kind of part one of the symposium, was kind of where are we in terms of this problem? Yeah. And then part two was what are the solutions that are happening around the state to address this issue? And I thought it was a really great conversation for both of those sessions, but the second session in particular really brought a lot of hope. There were five presentations from like local and state entities, and we had Rebecca French from Connecticut DEEP, Department of Energy Environmental Protection, talking about. So she's with the Office of Climate Planning at DEEP and looking at all the initiatives, both around greenhouse gas reduction, really mitigation measures, as well as resilience, and just trying to get the word out about some of the grants and support opportunities through the state, and really thinking about opportunities to collaborate with the state, and what kind of legislation can DEEP potentially propose, or other state agencies to look at climate change from that kind of health angle. So that was really interesting. And then we had three kind of like local health departments or communities present, and one of them was Stamford. So Stamford has done quite a bit of air quality monitoring, both for particulate matter as well as nitrogen oxides, both of which have various health impacts. Usually, not just respiratory, like we think of air pollution as something we breathe in, but PM 2.5 in particular is there. These particles are so tiny that they not only enter your lungs, but they can actually get into your bloodstream.
Oh, wow.
And then they can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they can basically circulate through your blood around your body and cause inflammation everywhere, which is why it is so dangerous. It's also classified as a carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and it is just extraordinarily harmful, but most people don't realize that. Yeah. And so I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah. So Stanford's air quality monitoring. So they're monitoring for PM 2.5 and looking at where the hotspots are around their city, and then what we can do about them in terms of not like air filtration, thinking about protecting vulnerable populations, having access to, clean air, like air conditioning, spaces that are heated and cooled, and with filtered air. So really looking at what the city can do under its, climate action plan. I mean, they're unique in having that, but really climate action as a way of climate action and reducing air pollution as a way of improving public health. And these are initiatives coming out of their health department, not necessarily like other city entities, although they are very much collaborating across city departments. So yeah, that was neat. And then in Bridgeport, we heard from community organizers and community leaders in the East End which is a historically, lower income Black community that has multiple vulnerabilities in terms of highways and just a lot of busy roads, proximity to this creek, Johnson's Creek, which just frequently has sort of like flooding and sewage backup issues. There's a major landfill there that was called Mount Trashmore. And then there's also just, it's a food desert, so it's a place where it's really tough. And so when you have issues with underemployment, youth violence, and just a lot of like health issues like childhood asthma rates and lack of social services, lack of adequate support, a lot of that does have to do with the environment and the environmental racism that community has faced over many decades. And so these community advocates from the East End NRZ Market and Cafe, Debbie Sims and Karen Soares and their colleagues, they've basically envisioned, they've dared to envision a better community, and they have huge project where they were able to leverage state and federal funding to turn Mount Trashmore into Mount Growmore, which is going to be a community wellness campus with a hydroponic farm and really like a community space that transformed what was really a blight on the community into something that is going to help the community grow in a healthy, sustainable way. And then several years ago, they opened this market and cafe, again, to provide healthy food and a community gathering space in what is, otherwise a food desert. So a lot of that work is really, inspiring. It's very painstaking and long-term. Like, you really have to build those community connections, get people on board, and then so often environmental justice communities are forgotten, and they are that way because when a polluting site is set to be built or expanded, it tends to happen in places where there's not going to be a lot of local opposition because people might just be too busy working and don't know how to be part of those sort of public comment processes. They don't have the ear of their legislators. They don't have connections with experts who can help them deliver testimony about what they actually see and hear and feel and smell in their neighborhood. Like, the smell thing is always so shocking. These odor complaints and then the noise violations, and you can kind of imagine what that lived experience is like, but to hear that and to really get attention for that takes both determination but also partnerships. And they talked about, some of my colleagues at Yale partnered with them, and through student projects just helped them sort of understand regulatory processes and how to, when something is being proposed in your neighborhood, what kind of questions you need to ask of the developers and their lawyers, and of your state officials to actually document the health harms and also the underlying health risks and health disparities that are already being experienced, and thinking about those cumulative impacts, the impacts that add up on health over time from all of these different polluting sites, on top of the existing social and economic vulnerabilities from being a low-income community of color. So anyway, taking all of that like academic, like information about like social and environmental health disparities and like really supporting a community to in a self-empowered way, develop this transformative vision. It was really cool to hear, and they're close, but it's a long process. But they have they showed some renderings of this Mount Growmore campus. It was really inspiring, and just like people just broke out in applause.
That's awesome.
And then then there was some really interesting work coming out of Ledgelight Health District in southeastern Connecticut. So they're like Groton, Norwich, and a couple of other surrounding smaller towns. And they're just innovative and creative. They try to do what they can. So it's like, well, we don't really have funding for like a resilience. So resilience hubs are this idea that when the state declares a heat emergency and towns are opening up their cooling shelters, a lot of times the cooling shelters are like, it's like the library, or it's the senior center, or it's some other sort of existing community location, but it's it's not necessarily accessible, or the hours aren't, long enough, especially if it doesn't get that cool at night. They're not going to be open at night. You have to get there. Some people don't have transportation. And resilience hubs are more like kind of meeting people where they are, and not like cooling. It almost feels like a little punishment to have to go to a cooling center.
Yeah.
But the idea of the resilience hub, it's someplace that's almost like you can grab a cup of coffee and chat with your friends, but also it's air conditioned and with filtered air, right? So when it's really hot or there's like an air pollution event, that's someplace that you can find shelter. But it's just much more fun, and there's like community services or events and activities. So they kind of, they've done that. They've just through a lot of great community partnerships. And then also, given everything going on in the federal government and the fact that, climate change isn't top of mind, but they've been doing some like community exercises where instead of just talking about it, they asked, at these community workshops to have people draw like what they see as in their mind, they see as like a healthy, climate, healthy environment. Versus what they see as an unhealthy environment, and just like having that exercise to trigger people's mental, image of like, what does my community look like, or where did I grow up, and what does that look like, and how might that affect our health? Again, this is something led by a health department,
right?
Or sorry, not a health department. It's like a health district that covers multiple towns. So yeah, I think that's kind of actually gets to the fifth person on that panel, which is. It is the involvement of the health sector, and I think that also gives me hope. So the last speaker was Dr. Mark Mitchell he wears many hats and been very active. He's like an emeritus professor at George Washington University on health equity and climate or something. That's not his actual title. I'm totally misspeaking that. But he is a chair member or board member of Connecticut Health Professionals for Climate Action. And they are a member of Save the Sounds, CCCA, Connecticut Coalition for Climate Action. And they're a group of doctors, nurses, medical students who really see the health connections, and they're seeing it in their patients. They're seeing it in their communities around how climate change is impacting health, and they're determined to do something about it. So they're active in legislative advocacy. They are reaching out to their hospitals or places of work to think about sustainability initiatives and how to implement that sort of advice from a clinical perspective. I think like some of the impacts are kind of obvious, but they're not, right? Like this whole idea of this fine particulate matter affecting all of your bodily systems, and it's actually very strongly linked to heart attacks and stroke. Wow. So getting cardiologists, and if you have a heart condition, you really should stay out of the air pollution. You should really be wearing an N95 mask when during those days when it just quote unquote smells smoky out, right? It smells like a campfire. That smell is the particles out of incomplete combustion from wildfire smoke that is carcinogenic and is affecting all of your bodily systems. So you really need to protect yourself from that. If you're pregnant, there's a lot more like sensitivity to heat, and you really should be like trying to stay out of the hot like summertime, like the midday time. If like both for your own health as well as for your fetus, for your future child, there's a lot of just like really interesting research coming out about like all the different ways that like all the different body system and ages and stages of life that this affects. And so this group, the Health Professionals for Climate Action, they're trying to really organize themselves. So they're having a big conference in October in Hartford to bring together the health community. And I think they're really powerful, even though, you can say that maybe there's some more skepticism in the post-COVID ages around like what the public thinks of health professionals. In general, I think people still think of, actually nurses are sort of at the top of the list in terms of trusted health professionals. And then, and then it's doctors. And so they are still generally seen by most people as trusted sources of information. And so having that, having their voices in the room or, at the legislative office building or in the clinic or in, schools and other community places is really important. So I think all of those things together, the state initiatives, all of these cool local initiatives. And in Connecticut, every town is like unique, and we all like our like local control, right? And so but that's actually an opportunity to innovate and think about what works best for your community, who are the populations that you most need to reach, and then finally having like those health voices in the room.
Yeah,
give me hope.
I'm so glad, and it's great to hear about all those different things. Some of them are definitely ones that I had not heard about. And I've been familiar with Mount Trashmore over the years, and it's fantastic to hear that there's potential progress on the horizon there.
Yeah.
Jen, thank you so much once again for coming up and joining us and being a part of this project. It's been wonderful to speak with you.
No problem.
I wish we had more
thanks
time.
so much for having me. I know. Yeah, thank you. You're really easy to talk with, so I just kind of talked.
It's great. It's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.